Florida once faced a problem so severe that officials greenlit a controversial plan. They released thousands of hungry snakes into farmland to wage war on destructive, disease-spreading rats. Critics called it reckless. Farmers braced for disaster, and no one believed it could actually work. But within years, the consequences stunned everyone, turning an ecological gamble into one of the most unlikely comebacks in recent history. How did unleashing nature's own predators turn disaster into triumph? The answer lies in what really happened next. Rodents thrive in the shadows, but in these Florida fields, their numbers exploded into daylight. Grain silos rattled with movement. Citrus groves and sugarcane rows showed the signs: chewed stems, hollowed fruit, droppings scattered where harvests once promised profit. Invasive rats arriving through shipping ports and stowing away in cargo multiplied with every warm, wet season. Their nests burrowed into irrigation lines, gnawed through plastic and wiring, and turned barns into breeding grounds. Farmers tallied their losses in truckloads, not bushels. Some watched as half their yield vanished before it ever reached the market. Traditional weapons barely scratched the surface. Poisons killed rats, but also poisoned hawks and owls. Anticoagulant baits left dead birds scattered across fields and contaminated the very crops they were meant to protect. Traps filled overnight were emptied and filled again. Never enough. Extension agents counted the cost in millions, year after year, as insurance claims and lost revenue mounted. Reports from the early 2000s warned of rising leptospirosis and salmonella cases traced to rodent contamination in packing houses and storage bins. And even the Centers for Disease Control flagged the region as a hotspot for rodent-borne illness. The scale was staggering. One agricultural region estimated over $1.5 million in direct crop losses in a single season, with an untold sum spent on failed control efforts. Some growers abandoned fields altogether, declaring bankruptcy rather than face another year of ruin. The sense of urgency grew with every ruined harvest. Farmers demanded new tools. Biologists sounded alarms about the collateral damage from chemical warfare. The old methods were not just failing, they were making things worse. In this atmosphere of frustration and fear, desperation set the stage for a radical proposal. The idea was simple on paper, but wild in practice. Harness nature's own predators. The logic was as old as farming itself: where rats go, snakes follow. But nothing in Florida's history had prepared anyone for the scale or the controversy that would come next. The idea moved from rumor to reality in a single crowded meeting at the county extension office. On one side of the table sat the program coordinator, a wildlife biologist with years spent tracking native snakes through Florida's tangled undergrowth. Across from him, a circle of skeptical farmers, faces sunburned and arms folded, waited for answers. The biologist laid out the plan. Select only native, non-venomous species known for their appetite for rats: corn snakes, yellow rat snakes, and black racers. These were snakes that once thrived in Florida's farmlands, before habitat loss and pesticides pushed them out. The coordinator pointed to data showing these species target rodents almost exclusively, rarely bothering birds or farm animals. The scale of the proposal dwarfed anything in state memory. Thousands of snakes, bred in captivity and sourced from wildlife rescues, would be released across the worst-hit agricultural corridors. No cages, no tracking chips, just a flood of predators unleashed where rats had overrun the fields. Placement maps were drawn with precision, targeting barns, irrigation canals, and the tangled borders of citrus groves, places where rats bred fastest and where snakes could slip away from roads and machinery. The logic was hard to dispute on paper. restore a missing predator, and let natural selection do the rest. Opposition was immediate and loud. Farm association leaders accused the agency of trading one problem for another. Some warned that snakes would scatter into nearby neighborhoods, spooking residents and driving down property values. Others doubted the snakes would survive at all, predicting mass die-offs from tractors, pesticides, and hawks. The program coordinator fielded every question, promising strict monitoring and rapid response if things went wrong. A field technician described protocols, post-release surveys, night counts, and regular health checks on a sample of tagged snakes. Despite the storm of protest, the plan advanced. The first batch of snakes arrived in late spring, delivered in heavy canvas bags and stacked in the backs of pickup trucks. Local newspapers ran headlines calling it an act of desperation. But with crops at risk and no better options on the table, the release began. What started as a last-ditch experiment quickly became the most talked-about wildlife project in the state. Field logs from the first summer told a story no one wanted to hear. Within weeks of release, the numbers began to drop. Technicians walking the rows at dawn found bodies flattened by tires on access roads, the bright scales of corn snakes dulled by dust. Others turned up in irrigation ditches, drowned or tangled in plastic debris. Hawks circled overhead, taking easy prey from open ground. By the end of the season, more than half of the released snakes were gone. A few were taken by predators, and many simply vanished, their radio tags silent in the undergrowth or crushed beneath tractor wheels. Night surveys painted the same picture in every zone. Of the thousands released, only scattered individuals turned up in the scheduled counts. Some had migrated far from the drop sites, slipping into bordering woodlots, disappearing into culverts, or winding their way toward the wild edges of the property. The rest left no trace at all. The field team's frustration bled into their reports. There were too few snakes, too wide a territory, and too many hazards, no matter how the data was sliced. The population curve only pointed downward. Meanwhile, traps set for rats overflowed as before. Grain stores showed the same telltale gnaw marks. Crop inspectors logged no improvement in damage or contamination. Extension agents, pressed for answers, could offer nothing but the raw numbers. Rat counts unchanged from the previous year. Disease warnings still in effect, and insurance claims climbing. Rumors spread faster than the snakes themselves. Farmers called the program a farce, pointing to empty fields and empty promises. Local papers ran headlines mocking the vanishing snake army. At a follow-up meeting, the biologist who had championed the project faced a wall of skepticism. The field technician read out the latest figures. Mortality rates above 60%, no measurable impact on rodent populations, and no evidence that the remaining snakes were staying put. Even the most optimistic projections looked grim. By winter, the project seemed all but abandoned. The data was clear, the critics loud, and the fields just as vulnerable as before. What started as a bold experiment now looked like an expensive failure, with little to show but a dwindling list of tagged survivors and a stack of frustrated field notes. Telemetry tags still pinged from the margins of barns and the tangled brush along irrigation ditches. A handful of survivors, battered by the first season's gauntlet, had stopped wandering and started to settle in. It was here, in the microhabitats where rats bred fastest, that the snakes found what they needed: steady warmth, shelter from tractors, and an endless supply of prey. Field notes from late spring described a new pattern. Instead of scattered, aimless dispersal, the remaining snakes concentrated around the same hotspots, sometimes within yards of the original release points. The program coordinator, reviewing the year's data, noticed something that hadn't shown up before. The snakes that survived the initial die-off weren't just hanging on, they were thriving. When the first clutches of eggs hatched, technicians began finding juveniles curled beneath loose boards and among the roots of citrus trees. Unlike their parents, these young snakes showed no sign of dispersal. They grew up surrounded by the scent of rats and the noise of farm machinery, learning every hiding place and escape route from the moment they emerged. Night surveys in midsummer recorded a sharp uptick in snake sightings near grain storage and along the berms of irrigation canals. The telemetry team mapped their movements and found tight clusters, often overlapping with the highest rat activity. The snakes had become specialists, exploiting every gap in the landscape that rats had carved out. Breeding success was confirmed by autumn. Field crews collected shed skins and eggshell fragments, evidence that at least 2 generations now occupied the same territory. The coordinator's field log from September recorded the first wild-born juveniles, their patterns brighter and movements more cautious than the adults. These snakes, born into a world of tractors and harvesters, showed a kind of sight fidelity that their parents never had. For the first time, the data hinted at something more than survival. The survivors were not just holding on, they were building a foothold, generation by generation, in the heart of the rat problem. The program, written off as a failure, now showed the first fragile signs of working. The question was no longer whether the snakes could survive, but whether they could tip the balance in a landscape stacked against them. Predators do more than thin out prey. In Florida's battered fields, the few snakes that survived the initial chaos began to reshape the behavior of every rat in their reach. Biologists tracking the experiment noticed something subtle but profound. Rat numbers did not plummet overnight, but the rodents themselves changed. They stopped venturing far from shelter, darted between cover, and left grain bins untouched for longer stretches. The difference was not in the number of bodies, but in the way fear rewired the rats' daily routines. Epidemiologists studying the aftermath found that rats exposed to regular predator presence spent less time foraging and more time hiding. This simple shift meant less food gathered, fewer calories stored, and weaker bodies heading into breeding season. Female rats delayed or skipped litters, and the pups born were smaller, less likely to survive. The pressure did not just kill rats, it suppressed their ability to bounce back. Each snake in the field became a shadow that haunted every rat, even those it never touched. This phenomenon, known as a landscape of fear, has been documented in ecosystems around the world, but rarely with such clarity in an agricultural setting. The presence of predators alters the entire rhythm of prey life. Rats, once bold and ever-present, became cautious and scarce, their movements dictated by the patterns of the snakes. The impact rippled beyond the kill count. Disease transmission slowed as rats avoided open areas where contamination spread. Crop damage dropped, not just because fewer rats survived, but because the survivors ate less and moved less, wary of every rustle in the grass. The real success was not measured in the number of rats removed, but in the way the survivors lived, nervous, hungry, and constantly on alert. By letting fear do the heavy lifting, the snakes accomplished what poison and traps never could. They changed the rules of the game. The landscape itself became hostile to rats, and that invisible pressure kept populations in check more effectively than any human intervention. The story unfolding in these fields was no longer just about predator and prey. It was about how behavior, shaped by millions of years of evolution, could tip the balance in a war for survival. Numbers told the story better than any headline. In the 3rd and 4th years after the snake releases, biologists compared rat counts in fields with established snake populations to those in areas left untouched. The difference was staggering. A consistent 60 to 70% drop in rat numbers where snakes had taken hold. The fields that once echoed with the scurry of rodents grew quieter. Crop inspectors tallied fewer chewed stems and spoiled bushels. Packing houses reported a sharp decline in contamination alerts, and health officials noted fewer cases of leptospirosis and salmonella traced back to farm storage. The economic turnaround was impossible to ignore. Before the program, farmers had spent millions every year on poisons, traps, and insurance deductibles, only to watch their yields shrink. The Snake Project, in contrast, cost a fraction of the old methods. There were no ongoing bait purchases, no labor for daily trap checks, no dead animals to dispose of. Once the snakes established themselves, their numbers rose and fell with the food supply, requiring no further intervention. In budget meetings, the math was simple. Less money spent, more crops saved, and a healthier bottom line. The rebound didn't stop at the harvest. With rats in retreat, ground-nesting birds that had vanished from the fields began to return. Quail broods reappeared in the brush, and killdeer nested along the margins of irrigation ditches. Field notes recorded the first sightings of bobwhite calls at dawn, calls that had been absent for years. Small mammals, outcompeted by rats for food and shelter, started to reclaim their old burrows. Even raptors benefited. Hawks and owls, once poisoned by rodent baits, now hunted healthy prey. The snakes themselves became a new food source for these birds, strengthening the food web from the ground up. Predictions that snakes would overrun neighborhoods never came true. Monitoring teams logged almost all snake activity within the original release zones, drawn by the steady supply of rats and shelter. Suburban sightings remained rare, and when they did occur, the snakes moved on quickly. The program coordinator, once grilled by angry growers, now fielded calls from neighboring counties eager to join the effort. One farmer who had threatened to sue if snakes crossed his fence line became a convert. He watched his yields rebound and his insurance premiums drop, then lobbied for more releases on his land. The experiment, once written off as madness, had delivered results that chemicals and traps never could. Florida's fields, once overrun and abandoned, now thrived with a balance restored by predators that had been missing for decades. The numbers on the page matched the stories in the fields, a rare victory where nature, given a second chance, proved itself the best partner in the fight against pests. In a world still grappling with invasive species and ecological missteps, Florida's experiment, real or imagined, reminds us that nature's solutions often defy human expectations. The lesson stands. Sometimes resilience emerges where we least predict. As we engineer the future, the wild still writes the final draft. What would you risk to restore balance? Share your thoughts.